In this week's instalment of Learning How to Light, I'm going to talk about how you can still get decent exposures when the light gets more complicated than your camera's meter can handle, why I tend to shoot most things in manual mode, and going very old school by talking about using external handheld light meters. The last thing in this section, I'm going to talk about getting exposure right, because it's going to become more and more important the more and more complicated we make our lighting setups. Now, it's true that you can use your camera on some sort of automatic exposure mode, and if you've got something like a dedicated flash gun that's attached to and talking to the camera and works in TTL mode or similar, your camera's meter will probably do a half decent job of getting you an okay exposure. You can probably play around with it, you'll have some variation, you can choose to under or overexpose with compensation, and it might even do a decent job of mixing, say, the light from the flash with the continuous ambient light you've got. So you'll be okay. You might then be able to take this off the camera with a dedicated cable, but a camera's meter is going to run into trouble when you start to add lots and lots of different lights, particularly lots of different flashes. If those lights are not connected to the camera, so they're not talking to the camera's meter in any way, unless they are part of a dedicated system. Now again, if you've got money to burn, you can go and buy a whole set of Nikon dedicated flash guns or a whole Profoto set like I've got, and they'll all talk to each other and they'll talk to the camera in some ways. The drawback, of course, is that's very, very expensive. If you're just starting out in lighting, you can achieve lots of the same effects with a £50 flash gun as opposed to a £350 flash gun. And of course, by the time you've bought a set, you're looking at thousands of pounds rather than maybe a few hundred. So yeah, you can get around these things, you can use automatic exposures, you can have dedicated TTL, all these sorts of bits and pieces to get the exposure right, but it's much more expensive. Your camera will also struggle with lots of different lights. So you might have one on TTL, you might have one on manual, you might have a tungsten light somewhere, and a camera's meter is going to struggle with that a little bit. Certainly an automatic exposure mode may well struggle with it. Now when you're learning how to light, I would stick to manual exposure on the camera and manual power output on any flashes or other lights you're using. Now, not only is this the best way to learn because you will see immediately the effect you're having when you make certain changes to things, but it gives you repeatable consistency from shot to shot. Hopefully you're familiar with the concept that if you use an automatic exposure mode, whilst it might give you an okay exposure, if you only reframe very slightly to include, say, a larger, darker area or a larger, lighter area, the exposure output may change quite dramatically, both from lights you're using and from the exposure in the camera. That can get very frustrating if you've gone to the lengths of creating a shot perfectly and putting the lights exactly where you want and getting the effect you want, if it's then not consistent from shot to shot. Whereas, of course, if you use manual power and manual exposure, it'll be the same every single time. It's for this reason that I shoot in manual, both on the camera and on flashes and other lights I'm using, at least 95% of the time. The catch is, my camera's meter can't give me an accurate exposure from some manually powered flash I've set up 20 feet away if they're not talking to each other. The greatest asset of using manual power, that it's consistent from shot to shot, can of course also be its biggest downside, because if I'm set for a certain exposure on the camera and my flash is set for a certain power output, they may actually be completely the wrong settings. And until I correct them, until I do something about it, I could be shooting lots of frames that are very, very incorrectly exposed. It can be very, very easy, if you're in manual mode on the camera and manual mode on the flash, to get exposure very wrong. Because of course the pulse of the flash is so brief that the camera can't take an exposure reading from it unless they're connected in some way, either directly on camera like this or via some dedicated cable or via some high-end TTL slave metering mode. But for those sort of things, you have to have a dedicated system, and as I discussed earlier, that gets quite expensive. So how do you get a decent exposure when shooting and lighting in manual? Well, one thing that I do almost all the time is simply check the back of the camera. That may seem like it's cheating, but it's very, very useful indeed. Be sure to check the histogram as well, so that you can be certain you're actually looking at a proper exposure readout rather than simply a brighter or darker screen than the area around you, because LCD screens can be very misleading. You can look at an image in a dark area and think, oh, that's perfectly great, because of course the LCD is bright by comparison. If you don't understand what histograms do, then now's the perfect time to go back and take my technical course where I'll explain to you what histograms are and how they explain exposures and can be much more honest than an LCD screen. The screen in the back of the camera is also superb for showing you what effect different lights are having. You can very quickly see that that light you've added to come across somebody's shoulder is too bright because you can see the relative differences. Part of the reason I can get away with using this so often is I shoot a lot of the time, and I've been shooting for a very long time, and I use equipment consistently. So I can quite confidently walk into a scenario and know that if I put a certain light inside a certain modifier here and other lights over there, if they're set for a certain power, those two are on quarter power, this one's on half power, and my exposure is such and such at such and such an ISO, I know I'm going to be pretty close because I've used the same equipment over and over again, the same settings over and over again. So experience definitely has advantages. I'll often set these things up and I'll be no more than maybe half a stop out, which of course I can quickly correct from looking at the back of the camera. Of course, that's not an option available to you if you're just starting out. The most accurate way to determine exposure, particularly if you're in manual mode on the camera and manual mode on your lights, is to use a handheld meter like this. Now this obviously adds an extra step to your workflow, and you might think, oh, this is yet another toy to buy. These aren't actually very expensive. This was, I believe, under £100, and I've had it for about 20 years. They do last forever. This can measure not only the continuous ambient light you might get under tungsten or daylight, but can also measure flashlight and can even be used to trigger your flashes. One important thing to consider is that a handheld meter like this measures what's called the incident light. The meter inside your camera measures what's called reflected light. Incident light is the light that's actually falling on a subject, and reflected light is the light that's reflecting off a subject into the camera. Now, this means this is more of an objective reading. This will not be fooled by what your subject is. The problem with any reflected reading, which is the case in all camera meters, is that the subject can easily skew the meter reading. If you took two people, one dressed all in white and one dressed all in black, and stood them under exactly the same lighting, a reflected reading would be biased by the white or black clothing. If it saw the white, it would try and underexpose because it would say, oh, the scene's very bright, there's lots of white here. And if it saw the black clothing, it would say, oh, we'd better overexpose this a bit, this is a very dark subject, irrespective of the fact that the light falling on both of them is exactly the same. If you take an incident reading with a meter like this, you will get exactly the same reading no matter what your subject is wearing, doing, what colour they are, how bright they are. Okay, so an incident reading is more objective. To use, you simply set your ISO as well as your aperture or shutter speed, depending on what mode you're using. Then you press the big button to take a reading. Then you set your camera to what the meter tells you. Here's the tricky bit though. These meters are very accurate. They can give you a reading to within 1/10 of a stop. And don't forget that it's reading the light falling on it. This makes where you place it to take the reading very important. Now, if you dig around online, like anything, you'll find a million and one opinions. You'll find all sorts of suggestions as to exactly how you should meter with these. I can only pass on my own experience and what I've been taught. The first thing I was told, the golden rule with these, is make sure you meter the light that your subject is in. Now, of course, this sounds basic, but you can just as easily be off by a few feet and be in shade as opposed to bright light. So make sure you're metering the right part, okay, where the light is falling onto your subject, the bit that you actually want to meter. I was also taught that, for example, in a situation like this where I'm sitting there, the light is coming from there, to actually meter straight back to the camera, like that. So I would take a reading there, okay, from my nose straight back to the camera lens. That's what I was taught to do donkeys years ago. The actual placement can be quite critical. For example, I just took a reading then straight at the camera with it held level, and it gave me at 1/6 of a second a reading of f4.5. If I tip it up, if I angle it up from where my nose was up to here, it gives me another half stop brighter, because of course there's half a stop more light there than there is around here. And if I angle it down in about the same place, it gives me nearly a stop less. A big, big difference just from angling from there up to there, down to there. So the angle you hold it at can be quite critical. To check the exposure of other lights in your scene, simply point the meter back to those lights and read off the relevant reading. Let's say, for example, I've got lights that are over my shoulders, out of shot, and are throwing a light onto here. And I want to get their exposure one stop brighter than the light that's hitting my face. So let's say I've metered the light on my face and it's coming out at f8. I would then aim this light back at my other light over my shoulder, take a reading, and I want to get the power of that light until this reads f11. So it's one stop brighter than the light falling on my face. Important thing to remember when you're doing that though, when you're reading from different light sources, is try and make sure your reading is as discrete as possible in that you're just reading that light, not the light from all over the place. You may need to, for example, shade where the light is falling on the little invocone on top of the meter there, so that it's just reading the light from one particular light source. So we know we've got to be careful exactly where we angle this meter and where we point it. But the last thing we need to bear in mind is that there may well be a difference between the readings on here and the settings on your camera. Now, if you remember the basics of exposure, you'll recall that f8 on a certain lens is the same as f8 on another lens, and so on and so on, and that ISO 100 in a camera is the same as ISO 100 in a different camera. Unfortunately, in practice, that's not quite the case. There can be quite a large variation in the exact exposure you get from lens to lens, and the sensitivity of the sensors within cameras can vary quite a lot. Camera manufacturers are particularly keen to claim that they've got more speed than they actually have. It also used to be the case in the olden days with film, no less. Back when I shot a lot of film, it was very, very common for a film to be listed faster than it actually was. I remember a lot of slide films used to shoot that were rated at ISO 100. If you shot them and exposed them at ISO 100, they often came out a little bit dark. What you found was that you actually set your meter to ISO 80, and by default, right across the board, you gave them a third of a stop more exposure every time, and they came out looking much better. Now, you may find that this is the case as well with your camera. You may find that what reads out at ISO 100 on one of these is not ISO 100 on your camera. You may find that f8 on your 85mm lens is coming out brighter than f8 on your 50mm lens, and so on and so on. This is obviously a problem. Okay, you're going to have to get around this, and the best way to get around it is simply to calibrate your meter to the various bits of your equipment. The best way to calibrate your meter to your camera equipment is to shoot a test subject. Shoot a test subject that can be consistently lit from shot to shot. Obviously, you don't want something that's going to be different every shot anyway, because that's certainly not going to be usable as a nice standard objective test. And ideally light it with quite soft lighting, so you haven't got a massive contrast between the highlights and the shadow areas, because that will further increase the risk of you taking different erroneous readings. Take a reading with the meter, transfer those settings to the camera, then do this with different lenses, so ensure you get an exposure with an aperture that all your lenses have. I wouldn't set your exposure, for example, to f1.4. If only a couple of your lenses can open to f1.4, I'd try and get an exposure to about f8, because every lens is like to have f8, and see if you notice any difference in the images out of the camera. Now, you may be very lucky, don't get me wrong. You might find that whatever is read out on here will match exactly what your lenses and camera are giving you. If so, happy days. If, when you lay all the images out on screen and you go, hang on, that f8 on that zoom lens is definitely darker than f8 on that 50mm lens I've got, try and work out what the difference is, and then you'll know for future reference that if you're using your handheld meter and you're using your zoom lens, let's say, that you know is half a stop, third of a stop too dark, to allow for it when you take a meter reading. And if you find that your camera sensor is consistently claiming to be off, and usually it'll be claiming to be more sensitive than it is, because camera manufacturers like to think you've got more speed than you have, then remember that when you're shooting with your handheld meter and say your D4, to simply set this for a third of a stop brighter, or half a stop brighter, whatever it might take. Now, whichever way you end up using a light meter, consistency is key. If you've got in a certain habit of holding the light meter at a certain angle of your wrist, stick with that. Okay, the worst thing you can do is suddenly start reading here, 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 all over the place, because this then won't help you at all. But if you're consistent from shot to shot, you'll find something like this is very, very useful. I still use it probably 5–10% of the time, particularly on shoots where I've got lots and lots of lights on the go, because it's a very accurate way of assessing how powerful different lights are, what the balance is between, say, the continuous ambient light I've got and my flashes. Not a bad investment to make at all, but only if you use them properly. Right, hopefully that was not too technical for you, but it is pretty fundamental stuff. There's no point doing all this clever lighting stuff if your exposures are then shot. As always, this is part of a weekly free lighting course that I'm putting together. Subscribe so you get updates. Hit like if you like what you're seeing. Stick any questions you've got in the comments below, and I'll see you very soon, hopefully.